Long before there was a United States of America, long before there was a flag, a constitution, or even a shared national identity, there was Massachusetts. This was the place where people stopped thinking of themselves as subjects of an empire and began thinking of themselves as something entirely new, something independent, something dangerous to old world power. This was where Americans were first made. The men and women who arrived in Massachusetts in the early 1600s were not searching for comfort or easy lives. They came knowing the risks. The land was unforgiving, the winters brutal, the soil rocky and difficult to farm. Disease, hunger, and death were constant threats. But they came anyway, driven by a belief stronger than fear, that no king, no church, and no distant authority had the right to rule their conscience or dictate how they lived. Massachusetts demanded strength. Survival required discipline, cooperation, and responsibility. Communities could not rely on distant rulers to save them. They had to govern themselves. Out of necessity, towns formed systems of shared labor and shared decision-making. Town meetings were not symbolic traditions. They were real exercises of power. Ordinary men stood up, argued openly, voted publicly, and accepted the consequences of their decisions. Over time, this created something rare in human history: a population trained to govern itself. This way of thinking became instinct. While other colonies hesitated, Massachusetts questioned authority. Why should laws be written by men who had never stepped foot on this land? Why should taxes be paid to a crown that offered no representation? Why should obedience be automatic? Boston became a center of debate, printing presses, and political thought. Taverns turned into classrooms. Ideas of liberty spread from docks to farms to meeting halls. By the time British troops marched into Boston, Massachusetts was already different. The Boston Massacre was not just violence in the streets, it was a revelation. 5 colonists were killed in the snow, and instead of fear, the colony responded with unity and anger. The lesson was clear. Power would answer resistance with force. From that moment forward, many in Massachusetts understood that freedom would never be politely granted. Then came the Boston Tea Party. Under cover of darkness, men risked their lives to make a statement to the most powerful empire on earth. They dumped British authority into the harbor and made it clear that obedience without consent was over. This was no longer protest, it was identity. Massachusetts had crossed a line willingly, knowing there was no turning back. When British forces attempted to tighten control completely, Massachusetts answered with gunfire. At Lexington and Concord, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers stood their ground against trained soldiers. These men were not professional warriors. They were citizens shaped by hardship, debate, and self-rule. When the first shots rang out, they marked more than the beginning of a war. They marked the birth of a people who would no longer kneel. Massachusetts did not simply host the opening battles of the American Revolution. It forged the American mindset itself, defiant, self-governing, unwilling to surrender freedom for safety. Before America existed as a nation, it existed here. This was the place where Americans were made. By the mid-17th century, Massachusetts was no longer just a colony. It was a problem for the British Empire, a problem for kings who believed authority flowed downward, and a problem for any power that expected obedience without consent. Massachusetts had become a place where resistance was normal. Generations raised on town meetings, open debate, and shared responsibility no longer saw authority as sacred. They saw it as something that had to be earned. British laws were no longer accepted simply because they were written. They were questioned, challenged, and often ignored. This mindset spread through Boston and outward into the countryside. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the endless taxes. None of them landed quietly in Massachusetts. Every new demand from London was met with arguments, boycotts, and public defiance. Crowds gathered, pamphlets circulated, voices grew louder. Massachusetts was not asking for revolution yet. but it was no longer willing to submit. British leaders noticed. Boston was placed under increasing military occupation. Redcoats patrolled the streets. Cannons overlooked harbors. Soldiers were quartered among civilians, meant to intimidate and control. Instead, they only sharpened resentment. Massachusetts did not fear soldiers. It resented them. The Boston Massacre made that resentment impossible to contain. When British troops fired into a crowd and killed colonists, the violence shocked the colonies. But in Massachusetts, it solidified identity. The people did not scatter. They organized. They documented. They told the story their way. The event was remembered not as chaos, but as proof that unchecked power would always turn violent. Massachusetts learned that words alone were no longer enough. Committees of correspondence formed, connecting towns and colonies. Militias trained quietly, but seriously. Weapons were stored, signals planned. Ordinary men prepared themselves, not as rebels, but as defenders of what they believed was already theirs. Then came the Boston Tea Party. This was not reckless anger, it was disciplined defiance. Men planned carefully, executed cleanly, and vanished into the night. They destroyed British property openly and accepted the consequences without apology. Massachusetts was no longer pretending loyalty to a system it rejected. The British response was swift and harsh. Ports were closed, rights were stripped away. Massachusetts was punished as an example. Instead, it became a symbol. Other colonies watched closely and saw something new taking shape, a population willing to endure suffering rather than surrender principle. By the time British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts was ready. The men who gathered that morning were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. But they were trained in something more important than marching: responsibility. They believed the defense of liberty belonged to them personally. When the first shots were fired, Massachusetts did not hesitate. It answered, and in that moment the people of Massachusetts crossed a final line. They were no longer colonists arguing with an empire. They were Americans defending their way of life. The revolution did not begin because Massachusetts was reckless. It began because Massachusetts refused to submit. And the identity forged there, resistance, responsibility, and self-rule, would define America forever. When the fighting spread beyond Massachusetts, the influence of the colony did not fade, it expanded. The ideas forged in New England did not stay local. They moved south and west, shaping how the war was fought and how the nation would later be built. Massachusetts did not just produce resistance, it produced leadership. Some of the most influential American voices came from this soil. John Adams did not merely argue for independence, he defined it. He believed law must rule over power, and principle must guide force. Even as war raged, Adams insisted America must be better than the empire it was replacing. His thinking helped shape a nation built on rights, not revenge. Samuel Adams understood something equally important, that freedom required participation. He knew revolutions were not won by elites alone. They were sustained by ordinary citizens who believed the fight belonged to them. His ability to organize, motivate, and unify made Massachusetts the engine of revolutionary energy. Then there was John Hancock. Wealthy, visible, and unafraid, Hancock put his name and fortune on the line. His signature on the Declaration was not vanity, it was defiance. It announced that Americans would no longer hide their resistance. Massachusetts taught its leaders that liberty required boldness. The soldiers reflected the same mindset. Massachusetts, men filled the ranks of the Continental Army early and often. They arrived already hardened by labor, discipline, and self-reliance. They were used to responsibility, used to decision-making, used to standing their ground. These were not men waiting for orders from above. They believed the fight belonged to them personally. That attitude spread. As the war continued, other colonies adopted the Massachusetts approach. citizen soldiers, shared sacrifice, and political purpose. The revolution was no longer just about breaking away from Britain. It became about building something new in its place. Even after independence, Massachusetts continued to shape the nation. Its constitution became a model for others. Its emphasis on education created an informed citizenry. Its insistence on civic duty helped define what it meant to be American. The belief that freedom came with responsibility was not theoretical here. It was practiced. Massachusetts also confronted hard truths. It wrestled early with questions of rights, representation, and equality. These debates were imperfect and often painful, but they mattered. They proved that America would not be static. It would argue with itself, challenge itself, and grow stronger through conflict. This was another legacy of Massachusetts, the courage to debate openly without tearing the nation apart. By the time the war ended, the identity forged in Massachusetts had spread across 13 states. Americans no longer saw themselves as scattered colonies. They saw themselves as one people, bound by shared values rather than shared rulers. That transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because Massachusetts taught Americans how to think, independently, critically, and fearlessly. It taught them that liberty was not inherited, it was maintained. The nation that emerged was not perfect, but it was powerful in a way no empire could be. Because it belonged to its people, and that idea, that the nation belongs to its citizens, was first proven true in Massachusetts. When the American Revolution finally ended, the world saw the birth of a new nation. But what it did not fully understand was this: America had already been shaped long before the final victory. The habits, attitudes, and beliefs that defined the United States had been forged earlier and nowhere more deeply than in Massachusetts. The war ended, but the Massachusetts mindset did not. The idea that citizens, not rulers, were the foundation of a nation became permanent. Americans no longer measured themselves by loyalty to a crown, but by responsibility to one another. Self-rule was no longer an experiment. It was an expectation, and that expectation followed the country as it expanded westward, fought new wars, and faced new challenges. Massachusetts had proven something rare in history. It proved that ordinary people could be trusted with power. The nation built on that belief would go on to outgrow every empire that doubted it. The United States became strong, not because it feared authority, but because it questioned it. Not because it avoided conflict, but because it believed liberty was worth defending. That instinct, challenge first, submit never, came straight from its birthplace. Even today, the influence remains. The emphasis on civic duty, free speech, debate, education, and law of a force all trace back to those early Massachusetts communities. The belief that Americans have the right and the obligation to speak up did not come from victory parades. It came from town halls, protests, pamphlets, and resistance. America's confidence did not appear overnight. It was built slowly by people who argued loudly, worked hard, and refused to surrender control of their lives. Massachusetts taught the nation that disagreement was not weakness, it was strength. That questioning authority was not rebellion, it was patriotism. The men who stood at Lexington and Concord did not fight for abstract ideals. They fought to protect a way of life they already lived, a life where decisions were shared, where voices mattered, where freedom was not a gift, but a responsibility. That idea still defines what it means to be American. When Americans talk about independence, they are echoing Massachusetts. When they defend free speech, they are echoing Massachusetts. When they resist being told how to think, how to live, or how to believe, they are carrying forward the same instinct that first took root on those rocky shores. Massachusetts did not just help create a country. It created a people who expect liberty, a people who defend it, a people who refuse to kneel quietly. That is why Massachusetts is not just another state on a map. It is the birthplace of the American identity. America did not begin with power. It began with defiance. And that defiance was born in Massachusetts.